Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led and run by journalists. Most books on Jerusalem focus on its history and architecture. In his new book, author and journalist Matthew Teller has written a modern account of the city and its people, and notably the repeated attempts by powers and states to reshape it in their own image, from the British Empire to Jordan and more recently Israel. Matthew joins us now. Hello and welcome, Matthew.
Hello, Nick. Thank you very much for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Sorry everyone about the slightly impromptu start. We had a bit of a technical problem here, but I think we got through it.
Absolutely fine. There's no impromptu-ness at all. I'm ready to go.
I'm going to apologise for everyone to start with. I've had COVID and I have not read as much as I'd like to of this wonderful book as I'd really like to have done. So it's been with COVID, you sort of seem to struggle with fatigue. Yeah. But anyway, it is what I've read has been very, very good, and I have done a bit of work, and it's going to be a very good discussion. So thank you very much. My apologies in advance. The great thing I love about it is, and this is a really good premise. And it's a premise that anybody who's been on a political tour knows about, and that this is a book not about monuments, it's about the people. And that's, I guess, that's where you started. And it might seem a surprising point to some people, but who knew in a way. When did you first have the idea that you were going to write? It's an obvious thing perhaps to write about, but not to many. Most people start from the historical point of view.
Yeah, I mean that's true. When you think of, and I've got some of them on the shelves behind. When you think of all the books that have been written about Jerusalem over the years, over the centuries, the focus has very much been on the history and on the monuments, and on the architecture and on the stones, if you like. And that was, in a sense, that was my way in. That I was struggling for a long time to try and refocus, and to try and present Jerusalem in a different way from the way that all those 10,000 previous books have done, by focusing on the people. It was a long process. It was a long process. I mean, I can tell you some of how it went, and I can tell you some of the background as well. When I was doing my research for this, I was thinking very hard about how to make that approach, and I was trying to be as self-aware as I could. So I was very conscious through the research and the writing of those 10,000, 100,000 books behind me, written by very often people like me, white, English-speaking, middle-aged, middle class. With a nice turn of phrase, whatever, you can able to spin a sentence.
But Matthew, I mean, I don't think you can apologise.
There's no apology. Absolutely no apology.
This is Jerusalem. People are going to write about it anyway.
Mm. Oh, yeah. But what I wanted to do was be aware of what had come before, and to be aware of the baggage that comes. It's impossible to approach Jerusalem without that baggage. And to try and pretend that I'm coming afresh and I'm arriving here and this is me and there's nothing behind me, I think would have been disingenuous. So I think it was important for me to understand what came before and to try and dodge a way around it. There's no apology. Absolutely no apology. You're right.
In answering that, you actually have made, the book makes a very good argument as to why many people before you have actually imposed their view of what the city is meant to be like on the city and its people. And that sounds like a sort of postmodern, post-colonial argument, but as you get into
don't run it down. Postmodern, post-colonial are good things. But anyway, carry on. Go on.
Yeah, but it becomes very, very evident, and that's with the book's title for starters, which is also captures your attention, and that's what you set about to demolish.
That's the idea. That was the idea. So I wrote the book because I could see an imbalance in narratives about Jerusalem in that culture that I'm coming from, that white English-speaking culture.
Yeah.
I have a platform. I'm very lucky to have a platform from which to speak. I wanted to use that platform to try and help to redress a balance that I saw was lacking. But But then you get into the tricksy nature of what balance actually is. It conjures up in our minds, images from the news media. It's a sort of image of a seesaw, where you have two sides. And in this case, an Israeli side, which is often conflated with a Jewish side, and against a Palestinian side, that binary. Okay. If you devote equal, go on, Hen. Go on.
What I want, let's take that first idea. I mean, we talk about the four quarters of Jerusalem, we, if you were about to do a political tour at the end of October, we take people there at least once a year, sometimes twice a year. So we go through. And I've never thought about questioning that concept. And that was one of the first things you began to look at and actually take to pieces.
It was. Okay, well, you're leading me into a sort of life story here. So let me do that. And I've got images as well. If I'm going to share my screen, if that's all right.
Yeah, you go ahead.
So let me click here and click there. That's the US cover of the book, which is also coming out soon in America.
I prefer the British cover.
The British cover is really nice. I also like the gold of what they did with the British cover was nice. Anyway, so I talked about a life story. I've been going to Jerusalem since I was a kid. Since I was 11, actually, was the first time I went, which was an awfully long time ago, 1980. And then shortly after that, 1982. My father arranged for me to have my bar mitzvah twice, once in the synagogue that we used at home in South London, and again in Jerusalem at the Western Wall. And that's the image on the screen at the minute is the image of the map of the old city of Jerusalem, which, for people who don't know, this is a walled area in the middle of the city, still surrounded by its Ottoman era battlemented walls. It's not a large area either. That area inside the walls where all the holy places are is less than a square kilometer. But you have about 35,000 people who live there. 90% of them are Palestinian. So one motivation for me writing this book, on all those visits from when I was a teenager through my 20s and my 30s and my 40s, returning, traveling, living, working, visiting, was seeing how people like me, the pilgrims and the visitors who come all the time, were reacting and interacting with the people who live and work in the old city, who raise their children, who've got a business, who are running their lives within this very tight area where all these holy places are. And what I was seeing, I don't think this is unique to Jerusalem either, but what I was seeing was that people would be visiting with a tick box, so they'd be coming as the culmination of a lifetime spiritual journey to pray at the church, or to visit the mosque, or to touch the Western Wall. And what I was seeing was that people were reacting to the lives that were being lived between themselves and their holy place, as if the people who were living there were an impediment. They were getting in the way. All this commerce, all this life, all this bustle, these crowds in the middle of the old city were, in a sense, I could see from people, were stopping me from getting to my holy place. That's quite a complicated thing to try and disconnect and to try and understand. It took me a long time to try and work out how to deconstruct that.
You've brought back a very vivid memory for me of, I think it's something about, and it's only about 2008 or 2009, and that's a young American Jew coming from Damascus Gate. He's Orthodox,
right,
and walking through the crowds with a pistol in his hand, and just going really fast to get to prayer time. And I'm thinking, quite incredible.
Yeah, well, it makes you wonder what movie people have playing in their heads, what people are thinking. But obviously, he felt under extreme pressure. He felt in danger walking through those streets.
Yeah.
But where that narrative comes from as well is something that's interesting, and where that idea of danger in walking through from Damascus Gate is nominally known as the Muslim Quarter, where that idea comes from, that the Muslim Quarter is dangerous. I'll get to that in a minute as well, because another motivation as well we talked about quarters, was seeing how all the maps that people like me and you and probably this guy with the pistol were using, and how they didn't match up to reality. I'm going to put another image up on the screen. That's taken from the internet. There's sort of news media sites on the internet, but they're very similar. Yeah, you'll recognize them as well to maps that we might see as tourists that divide the old city into these four quarters: Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter. But you've been there, and I was going there, and I was looking at where these lines between these very sharp, clear lines between these quarters are. There is no division between the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter. That line, if you look at, on the right-hand map, that really very clear straight line down the middle of the city, it's a market street. It's not very big. There's like 2 or 3 meters wide or something. There's stalls on both sides. There's people on both sides. There aren't really both sides. It's just a street. None of this makes any sense. There are churches in the Muslim quarter. There are mosques in the Jewish quarter. There are, people living everywhere. But what I was seeing was that, people approaching Jerusalem for the first time might well, and I think they were, be imagining that these quarters are holy. This is a holy city. And has it been divided into holy quarters? It's not an unreasonable thing to assume. It's a mistake. But then it's a short step from that to the next mistake, which is thinking, as we were talking about just a minute ago, that Christians, say, aren't allowed into the Muslim quarter, or Jews may not enter the Muslim quarter, or that Jews may not enter the Armenian quarter, or something. So you have a situation where somebody coming from outside, a Christian visitor, say, thinks that the Muslim quarter is sort of this enemy territory. It's wrong, and it's corrosive, and it's undermining. And I was looking at these maps when I was researching this book. It's a very Western conception. They look to me like sort of a school atlas of the states of Europe, all locking together very neatly. Or there's a place in the United States, in the west of the US, where Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico all meet at this Four Corners point, which looks to me like the map on the right on the screen here. And then I was thinking, well, that's instructive, because what's invisible in the formulation of those US state maps are the Native American lands of the Navajo and the Hopi and the indigenous people who lived there, whose lands were erased, and those state borders don't bear any relation to those lands.
What did you find? Nick. What did you find?
What do I find?
What did you find? What did you find? Are you trying to get to the bottom of these maps?
Right. Yes, that's the next point, is where do they come from? So I started to do some research. We go into a bit of history. These are early maps of Jerusalem. That one on the top is the oldest one that's surviving today. It's a mosaic, which is laid on the floor of a church in Jordan, which you can visit. But from that point, from early in the Middle Ages all the way through, Jerusalem is depicted in this idealized form. You can see it as a sort of a European fortress or a castle in these maps from the 7th century and the map from the 17th century, or in an idealized form, the one in the middle, the bottom right, as a perfect circle, which is drawn from the Bible as Jerusalem as being the navel of the world, omphalos. It's the belly button of humanity. But it's idealized. These are not representations of what Jerusalem is actually like. People would travel, but they would travel by word of mouth. So they would travel using local guides. They would travel using local knowledge. When people then returned home, quite often as a way of digesting and understanding the experience that they just had, they would draw a map to depict how they as an individual, they as a community conceived of a place. So alongside all of this, we have Arabic sources as well through this period. They talk of Jerusalem as this mixed cluster of neighborhoods. There's one historian who talks of 39 quarters of Jerusalem in the 13th, 14th century. There's another one who describes 18 quarters of Jerusalem in 1495. These are organic. These were neighborhoods that developed from the bottom up. And this situation lasted through to Napoleon. So in 1798, we have Napoleon invades Egypt, and then he invades Palestine. He, as well as military forces, he brings these artists and scholars and scientists and explorers who form this surge of interest in Arab and Turkish culture. And we see shortly afterwards the first maps of Jerusalem based on measurements actually taken in the field. And this is the first one. This is from 1818. And there's a ton of interest. I mean, I love these maps. This is dream territory. It's like catnip going through these maps. You can see that there's open areas within the walls of Jerusalem. In this map, east is at the top rather than north. And what I've highlighted is the only area labeled according to the ethno-religious makeup of the population there, which is it's Judenstadt, Jewish quarter or Jewish city. That's the next one. You look at the progression of cartography through the 19th century. This is from 1835. Again, this is an English map. There's a label for the Jews' quarter. What we start to see is labels for the Armenian convent and the Greek convent and the Latin convent, which are areas of Christian settlement around significant churches, which is reflecting European concern as Europeans have more and more contact with Jerusalem through the 19th century. This is the next one, 1837. Again, there's a Jewish quarter. Then we have a Turkish quarter and a Greek quarter, Armenian quarter, Latin quarter. As far as I'm aware, these quarter labels, this is the first time that these appear on a map, but this is also very different from the maps that we have today. So this period, the 1830s.
This is 1830 years?
This one is 1837.
37.
But this period here, this was a time of massive political upheaval in Jerusalem and in all of Palestine. There'd been a rebellion led from Egypt against Ottoman rule. There'd been a popular uprising in Palestine, which led to a power vacuum. You've got the European powers jockeying for position, trying to restore order, but also to take advantage of the instability to try and advance their own interests. We see foreign consulates opening for the first time in Jerusalem. And then 1840, Britain intervened, and as we often did in that period and also afterwards, we essentially bombed Palestine into submission. And then we handed Palestine back to the Ottomans. But British forces remained in place, and the Royal Engineers started to do a big survey of the Palestine coast, up and down the coast. And 1841, two of them came to Jerusalem to survey the city. But also at this time, to give context to those sort of geopolitical maneuverings, we also had British Protestant missionaries, evangelicals, who had long wanted to try and convert the people of the Ottoman Empire. They were unable to convert Muslims because Ottoman law stipulated death for people who converted away from Islam. They were unable to convert Catholics or Orthodox Christians, partly because there was little willingness in those communities, and partly because France at that time protected Catholic rights and Imperial Russia protected Orthodox rights. And there had long been, and there still is this strain in Protestant evangelical thinking. We see it a lot in America today, that sees the conversion of the Jews as a prelude to the second coming of Christ. So at this time, we see all these British efforts going into converting the Jews, which meant that the Brits needed to know exactly who lived where. So as well as these foreign consulates opening, at the same time, this is 1842, Britain appointed the first Protestant bishop of Jerusalem, who was a man called Michael Alexander. He was formerly a rabbi, and he converted away to Christianity. And now he comes to the nub of it, this man who came with him, who was a chaplain, young chaplain called George Williams, who was aged 27 at that time. He's only in Jerusalem for about a year. And he fancied himself a bit of a scholar, In 1849, he published this book, which I've got on screen. This was his book, The Holy City. And in the book, he included a map, which had been drawn from the Royal Engineers survey of a few years previously. But George Williams added all the labeling to it, including Christian quarter, Muslim quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter. As far as I can tell, I don't think that there have been historians who've done work in this area, and they've identified the period of time when the quarters appeared, when Europeans were taking a greater interest. I think I'm the first person to identify George Williams as being the instigator of the four quarters. All these maps before him didn't show them. And just about every single map after him has shown. So there's, we have a direct link from there, from George Williams of 1849, through to the maps of Jerusalem that we all see and use today, reinforced in the media and reinforced in literature and in academia and guidebooks and tourist maps and, every conceivable medium. And then you come to the question of why. Why has this idea of the four quarters survived? I would say, and I say in the book, because it suits and has suited the colonial ambitions of successive waves of rulers of Jerusalem since then, right down to our own time. The quarters are false. They were invented by a 19th century British old Etonian missionary. They always were false. But it suited Jerusalem's colonizers to divide the city's populations against themselves, to foster this kind of sectarian division. And, this is a little tiny bit from Williams's book. He was even aware what he was doing. If you remember all those, the 39 quarters from the 13th century, and you remember the 18 quarters from the 15th century, and even today, you think when you're walking around in Jerusalem, all those communities, all the different ethnicities and the religions and the social identifications, all those people who live and work in the old city, for Williams and for everybody since, all these map makers since, they are, and you can see this quote on the screen, numerous, but unimportant, I beg to differ, these subdivisions, which reflect the mixed nature of the city's populations, are very important. And as a journalist, I'm really interested in how we think of Jerusalem when we see it always divided.
That's the first premise. It's basically to say that the sort of divisions have been superimposed, that it's ignoring the local population in the process. That's the sort of first myth busted, if you like.
That's the idea. I hope it's successful. That was what I was planning to try and do. I think it's really important. I think, when we conceive of Jerusalem, not just in our generation, but going back generation upon generation, as being, as on the map, literally divided between Muslims here and Christians here, this idea of exclusivity, it's quite wrong.
I'm going to do an odd thing. And I don't know, I think people watching, we've been doing these programs for 2 years now, and people will be familiar with the backdrop, which is the fireplace. They probably might not have paid much attention to the photographs above the fire surround.
Oh, okay.
Go on. Take one or two off the wall now.
Do it.
All from Jerusalem.
Okay.
And then we'll come back to what you're saying. I'll just do
tell the story. You've got stories to tell as well. This is good.
I don't know if I can get up to him. I think.
I can't see. Is there one above? That's slightly out of shot there.
Too far up, too far away.
Okay.
But the guy at the top is a Yemenite Jew. He's a Yemenite rabbi.
Okay.
And
what period are we talking about?
These photographs, and you've written a story about the man who put these photographs together, who is an Armenian.
This is Elia, right?
Elia. So, and this photograph is of I think he's Greek Orthodox and a librarian. He's a librarian.
Okay. There's a slight reflection on the screen, but I can.
Yeah. And then.
Actually, I have my different glasses on to see this.
This chap here.
Oh yeah, that's lovely.
Yeah. Apologies for the reflection. And then you've got some a sort of young Muslim guy in a sort of dish dasher, what you might call a hunjar, dagger in his robes, looking very elegant. But the point is, they're all figures from Jerusalem, and they're all figures. The photographs are taken in between about 1890 and about 1920, and they are Jewish. They're Orthodox. They're Sunni Muslim. I don't have a photograph of a sort of Sufi celebrating, but they're all there in the same city together, and you can't distinguish between. It's not about nationalities. They just happen to be all. They happen to be of different faiths, but all in the one city. And this is what attracted me so much to your book. And I'm detracting from what you're going to say, and I know you're going to in a moment come back to the photographs. and we'll talk more about the man who put the collection of photos together in a second. But I want you to come back to having busted the myth, having said, look, these quarters are a mythical idea. They're superimposed in the 19th century. What did you then seek to do?
Okay. I mean, I'm happy to do that. I'm also happy to talk about Elia at any time. We can also, I've got his book here as well, which is absolutely marvelous. And there's a story to tell about that. And there's a story to tell about the poster, which is sitting behind me here. I'm very happy to come back to that.
We'll come back to that in a second.
We'll come back to it. Okay. So you've led me into the idea of communities and the different mix of communities. So I'll go back to share my screen, if that's all right.
Yeah, come.
And we'll run through some of the communities that I was lucky to come in touch with, and I was lucky to talk to. We'll start with this one. This is with the map on the left, which identifies the areas that I'm talking about in Jerusalem that they occupy. This one was a really fascinating place. Perhaps, one of the most fascinating places that I came to. This is the Indian hospice in Jerusalem. And in this context, Jerusalem has loads of these hospices. And in this context, the word hospice refers to a Muslim religious institution, specifically one that's related, as you said, to Sufis, mystical Islam. And this is amazing. This place commemorates a visit to Jerusalem 800 years ago by Baba Farid. I don't know if you can see on the bottom right. This lovely chap Nazar is pointing to the plaque over the entrance to a room and to a cave. It says his name, Baba Farid, up there, and also Shakar Ganj or Ganj Shakar, which means treasury of sugar. There's a little story attached to him. He's Baba Farid is one of India's most celebrated mystics, and his tomb in Ajmer is still visited by millions upon millions of people every year. There's continuous concerts of mystical devotional music. He's a massively celebrated figure, and he gained this nickname Shakar Ganj, which means, as I said, treasury of sugar, from a boyhood story where he was praying apparently so hard as a child that when he stopped praying and he picked up his prayer mat, his mum noticed that there'd been sugar left underneath it, which was a sign of divine intervention. And so she gave her child this name, Treasury of Sugar, ever since, and he kept hold of that, and he's still known by that today. He's supposed to have come to Jerusalem and meditated for 40 days in a cave. There's, as I said, within the boundaries of the Indian hospice, there's still a cave. You can go down inside it and squat down there. And there's a little mosque over the top of it. But now it's also home to this sort of cluster of Indian Palestinian families, or sort of one extended family, with a library. There are reception rooms, there are guest rooms. They're under a lot of pressure from neighbors. They're in a particularly sought after area, which has seen a lot of takeover of property by US backed extremist Zionist settlers. So they tend to try and keep themselves to themselves because they're aware of the pressure on property in the neighborhood immediately around the hospice. But it's a lovely place if you're able to get in there. I don't know, did you manage to get there ever in your visits to Jerusalem?
I haven't, there's that top right-hand corner, the sort of northeastern corner, and then also I'd say the southwesternmost extreme, which are the two bits that I don't know. And I think that's sort of all the sort of the pathways you sort of tend to follow.
Yeah, there's a few more. I mean, the next one is also up in that sort of roughly in that corner as well, which is the Afghaniya Hospice and the Bukharia Hospice, which are two religious institutions, sort of back to back. They're built with walls adjoining each other from behind. But they form this little community which has had this centuries-long tradition of hosting Muslims from Bukhara and these lands of Central Asia, Uzbeks and Tajiks and Turkmen and Afghans, and Uyghurs as well, and many more. I was very lucky. I took this picture. I was very lucky to get into a dhikr which they ran, a sort of a mystical ceremony preceded by a sermon, which I understood, unfortunately, very little of because my Arabic is nowhere near good enough to follow a sermon in theology, whatever. But then sort of the lights dimmed and there was music and there was chanting and we all held hands. It was a very, I've been to a few, I don't know if you've been to some of those. I've been to a few of those experiences. It's been sort of stretched over the years that I've been. I was in Cairo and I was one in Aleppo and different places.
I've never been to one in Jerusalem.
It's also the first I've been to in Jerusalem as well. I felt it like a massive privilege to be able to be allowed in, and to experience that sense of community and that sense of sort of religious devotion around me.
So just jumping in here, the point is, Matthew,
I've got loads of these pictures, but yeah, carry on. Go.
You're trying to establish, and this is what's so revealing. And I've been going to Jerusalem since, perhaps not as long as you have, but since 1989. And you've made me aware of communities that I didn't know existed there beforehand. And that's partly because we have so much focus on the Palestinian versus Israeli, and the religious major denominations that we think of. And there's some really surprising, that the Sufis is one I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And there are a couple other communities I had no clue about at all. And I don't know whether you want to sort of jump forward. Yeah. The one that really struck me was the Dom. We might think of them in Europe as being the Rom or the Romani. But I had I had no clue about their existence within.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Breaking that binary of Israeli and Palestinian was very important to me. That was a major thrust for writing the book, and also I benefited from having very generous people on the ground who were willing to open their doors to me and tell their stories to me and allow me to share their stories with the world as well. This was one. These are the Dom. There's that area in the top right-hand corner, as you said. The Dom. Well, yes, the Dom in English, they self-identify as Gypsy. But Gypsy is a word that has this troubled history in English. It was invented around the 15th century when English people were looking at newcomers who were coming in and mixing with them. And they thought that these newcomers came from Egypt, so they called them gypsies as a truncation of Egyptian.
In Kosovo, there's a group of Roma who self-identify as Egyptian, to the conclusion of the Egyptian embassy in Belgrade, that thought that they had a community of Egyptian citizens somehow lost during the wars of Yugoslavia and Kosovo.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. I wonder what. So they kind of took the name and then they expanded it back again.
So in Kosovo you have Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptian, and those are the three groupings of the Roma within Kosovo.
Really interesting. Wow. Yeah, because as you know, and as you'll be aware, the history is not Egypt at all; it's India. So the story of the Roma, or the other designations of what the Dom call them, gypsies, in Europe, come from India. There are these waves of migration, sort of 1,500 years ago, and these people moved west out of India, and they some settled in Armenia and the Caucasus. And I learned that they are the Lom. And then some people moved on and they moved into these areas in South and Southeastern Europe and then up into Northern and Western Europe. And they're the Rom or the Roma. And some settled in the Arab lands of the Middle East. And they're the Dom. So Lom, Rom, and Dom all have this common cultural heritage going back to India from more than a millennium ago. But in Jerusalem, the Dom have lived inside the walls for more than 200 years. But they suffer, as you might expect, extreme racism and discrimination. Because they identify as Dom, they do not call themselves Israeli and they do not call themselves Palestinian. They're Dom. They occupy the sort of a tiny space in between these two majority communities. And so they suffer grievously from both sides. Dom kids hardly ever graduate from school. Unemployment rates are very high. The jobs that people do are very menial jobs. They tend to be in service industries around sewage and drain cleaning and these kind of jobs. This lady on the screen is Amun Slim, who is an extraordinary person. She was amazing. She is incredibly generous with me as well. She's been building sort of community support networks within her community, within the Dom, for 20 years or more. She started in the old city. She's now developed, developed a network, so she has a base outside the old city in East Jerusalem. But she's running after-school clubs for Dom children to be able to get them through school and then through college. She's running vocational classes for women. She's doing literacy classes to try and improve literacy rates across the community. And, she's faced a lot of opposition from within her own community as well for breaking gender barriers and challenging patriarchy and challenging the existing power structures within her community. So she's a bit of a maverick, but she's the energy and the vision that she has and the willingness she has to sort of bring people around her and to push ideas forward, to push that vision forward. Incredible work that she's doing.
I'm conscious that I want to get to people's questions.
Sorry, am I talking too much? I've got 1,000 stories here. I could go on and on forever.
There's another story that I want to talk about, and that's what's might be called the sort of Moroccan area, or it's from the word Maghreb, which is merely more North African rather than Morocco.
Right.
And I think many people won't. I did know the story here, but many people who know Jerusalem won't possibly know the story of what happened in '67 and what happened to this community. So just tell us about where that term comes from and how long that neighborhood had been there for.
I will. It's a horrifying story. This is a lady called Maysoon, and she was the way in for me to be able to understand that story. She's Palestinian, but her family comes from Morocco and Algeria. And she's one of the last remnants of that quarter, the Moroccan quarter, which was, as you say, flattened by Israel in 1967 in order to create this huge plaza that we see in front of the Western Wall. It's a long story. I'll try and truncate it as much as possible. I'm also conscious of time as well. Maysoon's hand is resting on the tomb of supposedly the North African mystic Abu Madian, who, according to legend, was in Jerusalem in the 12th century. Fighting alongside Salah ad-Din against the Crusaders. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't, maybe it was his grandson, we don't know exactly, but it was around that time that land was given over in this area to establish this Moroccan quarter. And that neighborhood went through to the 20th century. So there's a comparison image there you can see on the left from the 1930s, on the right from today. And you can see the Moroccan quarter, which I've circled in with a dotted line, filling the space that's now the plaza in front of the Western Wall. And this is another image, an aerial image, also from the 1930s against one from today. So at that time, when the Moroccan quarter was established, the Western Wall didn't mean much in terms of Jewish religious practice. There's almost no mention of it in Jewish sources from that time. It is, however, it was at that point, and it still is today, a Muslim holy place. It's traditionally the place where Prophet Muhammad tethered his winged horse-like animal, Burak, that brought him to Jerusalem from Mecca on the famous night journey, which is mentioned in the Quran. And this wall became important as a Jewish holy place only really from the 16th century, when the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman made Jerusalem more attractive deliberately for Jewish settlement. And this was at a time when many places in Europe were expelling their Jewish populations, and Suleiman did the opposite. Jerusalem always had synagogues, of course, but Jewish public observance at that time was restricted to the Mount of Olives, which is off this picture to the left, and also the Golden Gate, which I've marked also on the left-hand side here. And
did this photograph this is taken from a great photo? I haven't seen this one.
It's a lovely one. It's one of those aerial shots from the 1930s. British did a lot of aerial photography around Jerusalem. And the Golden Gate mark there was as close at that time as Jews could get to the site of the former temple, which is marked by the Dome of the Rock, as you can see in the middle there. So what Suleiman did was, first he established a Muslim cemetery outside the Golden Gate, just along the line, that straight line of the wall there. And that cemetery is still there today. The purpose being to block Jewish prayer at that point. And instead, what he did was he created a way to bring Jewish public observance with this, I've done this sort of dotted line, all the way around and inside the city, inside the walls, by opening access to a stretch of the western wall of the mosque compound. And that point of the western wall is even closer to the site of the former temple. And the way he did it was by creating an alleyway beside the western wall and behind the last row of houses in the Moroccan Quarter, which I've marked here. You can see in the bottom left. This is another aerial shot. Yeah.
Really good photograph.
It's this is a famous one. This was taken oddly from the Zeppelin. The German airship Graf Zeppelin was did an overflight over Jerusalem in one day in April 1931, and they happened to take this picture, which is valuable beyond what they could imagine at the time, because you can see the alleyway that Suleiman created. You can see people praying at the Western Wall, and you can see the streets and houses of the Moroccan Quarter behind it. So, I mean, just to emphasize, Suleiman didn't do this. He didn't bring the Jews into the city out of the goodness of his heart or something. He did it for very clear economic and political reasons, but it lasted all the way through to the 20th century. So in 1948, there was, as there was across many places of Jerusalem, terrible destruction very near here, off this image to the right, in the fighting between Jordanian forces and the Zionist paramilitaries over the Jewish quarter, where homes were destroyed, synagogues were destroyed, people were killed, people were displaced. But the Moroccan Quarter was not targeted. And so Suleiman's alleyway in front of the Western Wall survived. And it looked like this in the 1960s. This is about 61 or 62. And then in 1967, Israel bombarded and occupied the old city. One day after the Israeli army seized the Western Wall, which is on the left, Israel's former Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion on the right visited the site. And first he said, with his finger wagging here, he said the walls around the old city should all be pulled down. Thankfully, that didn't happen. And then he said that the houses of the Moroccan Quarter, just nearby to where he was standing, just on his shoulder, should all be demolished to clear space in front of the wall for public Jewish prayer. So a plan was drawn up the next day. And the following night, soldiers came in, storming through the neighborhood, shouting, banging on doors. Men with sledgehammers went in first, about 11 o'clock at night. And then bulldozers worked, all through the night until by the morning, there was nothing left. So this whole neighborhood, 700 years old, was turned to rubble. People fled for their lives. One woman is supposed to have been killed because she was deaf. So she didn't hear all the shouting and the banging. And so she died when her house was demolished around her, which is awful. 30 years later, 30 years after this, an Israeli army engineer went on record and he said that workers that night had discovered several more what he called Arab corpses. Some were removed, he said, but others, he says, were just bulldozed into the dirt. So, presumably they're still there today, bulldozed into the dirt, these sort of victims of this urge for immediate revenge following 1967. I mean, it's a horrible story, but it is, as you said, it's much less known about than other horrible stories, like the story of what Jordan did in the Jewish Quarter in 1948, which is dreadful. People had also fled for their lives in the face of this widespread destruction. It's shocking. And then you go back to Maysoon, and so the building that Maysoon looks after, this small mosque with this small tomb, is just about the only building to have survived 1967. It's this little anonymous doorway. You go in, there's a small courtyard with these patterned tiles. You go up the stairs. There's a little mosque on the upper level,
Mm.
and Maysoon takes care of this tomb of this saint, mostly ignored by everybody, unfortunately.
The book is packed with other stories, similar stories that we haven't got into. We might maybe be able to mention a couple before we finish, but it really is worth getting. I have not finished it, and I'm going to.
That's right. You've had a very good excuse. You know, mortal illness is a very good excuse. See, now they've set you off. Now you see.
There we go. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I do want to get some questions, people. This is your opportunity. We've got 15 minutes to go, so please do put a question in the Q&A box. Matthew, this is a political book. I mean, we do political interviews and political discussions on this program. That's the whole point of this. But it's it's a biography of a city, it's a biography of the people. But you don't make any apologies for saying you're trying to represent or tell the stories of people whose stories have been marginalised, and really they've been marginalised. Partly by design by the British in the 19th century and the 20th century, but notably you're talking about now and Israel's conduct in the Old City as well.
I think it would be not just impossible. I think it would be a sort of dereliction of duty to try and write a book about Jerusalem that didn't include politics, that was trying to be non-political or apolitical. Politics. You'll know this as well. I'm sure people watching will know as well. Politics impacts everybody's life in Jerusalem every hour of every day, virtually. But particularly the people who are under occupation. So yes, I talked to at the beginning. I talked about that balance, and how the idea that if you apportion equal resources to both sides of that seesaw, you will have achieved balance.
Yeah.
But I deliberately, I set out not to do that. I didn't want to have equal numbers of stories, if you like, about Jewish Jerusalem and the Jews of Jerusalem and everybody else, because the seesaw is not level to begin with. You're not starting from a level playing field. So Israel has. I don't think it's
about communities that are struggling to survive, struggling to make a living, struggling way to keep their identities alive. There's one. You talk about a group of black families who are right by the entrance to Al-Aqsa Mosque, and then actually right next to the area where you enter when you start going down to the wall, where you enter the security gates. Where most Israelis would access there. They wouldn't.
That's a little way up from that.
The other side. But if you're coming from, I hesitate now to call it the Muslim Quarter.
This is the trouble. It messes with your head. I know what you mean. Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, that was another community who were extraordinarily generous and open-hearted. It's very difficult to get to see them now because this is a group of about 450 Muslim people who are black, who trace their origins from West and Central Africa. And it's a long historical story, which I won't go into at this point, but they settled and they still live in these two very ancient Mamluk era, 13th century courtyards opposite each other across a tiny alleyway, as you said, right at the gates of Al-Aqsa. But their alleyway is only about 90 meters long. One end of it is literally the gateway into Al-Aqsa, which is guarded by the Israeli
border police,
armed police. Yeah. And the other end of their alleyway is also guarded by the Israeli police. So there's a checkpoint here, and there's a checkpoint here. It's very difficult to be able to get in to see them as an outsider. But if you do, there's a whole other culture going on there. There's an African Palestinian culture, which is, to all intents and purposes for outsiders, invisible. And yet, it's been a mainstay, a key part of Jerusalemite, and particularly Jerusalemite Palestinian identity and culture and heritage, not just for the last century, up until, when the British arrived, but for centuries before that too. Their story goes back to the 11th century in West Africa, for heaven's sake. If your story of Jerusalem doesn't include Black history, Dom, Gypsy history, Indian history, I don't know, Arab history in its broadest sense, you're not telling the whole story.
Yeah. Do you? I mean, for me, it seems. I mean, there are fantastic books. Simon Sebag, Montefiore's, his that's meant to be the sort of defining history of Jerusalem. But it seemed I mean, I'm biased because I set up this company to go and look at what's actually happening today in places and not get bogged down in history. But it does seem to be a sort of a peculiar obsession why we want to look at churches and walls and the parallel, deliberately ignoring the people. But there's a long vein of it.
It's what we know. It's what we talked about right at the beginning. You can't approach Jerusalem without baggage. Everybody has baggage. Everybody has an idea of either what they want Jerusalem to be like or what they think Jerusalem should be like. And we've talked in the past as well about how disappointing Jerusalem is and has been to lots, particularly of Europeans and Americans. You look at the literature from the 19th and early 20th centuries of European and American visitors. They're bitterly disappointed at what they see, with real people living real lives in these places. It's nothing like what they wanted the kingdom of heaven, the great navel of the world, to be like. And they're even more disappointed when they go into the churches, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a mess for them. It's kind of this rambling church. You can't make any sense of it. There's Armenians there, and there's Greeks there, and there's Copts there, and there's Ethiopians on the roof, and there's Syriacs, and there's who are all these people? Clear them all away,
I can see.
It's very common.
Various familiar names on the right-hand side of my column. I can see who's watching, and I'd love to get a few questions just before we go. So
sure.
There's Lois Towart, who's in Sydney, Australia.
Good morning.
A few words to say. Geraldine Gill, who's in Houston, Texas. I'd love to hear from you, Jerry. Jerry did some fantastic. She came on a trip with us about 7 years ago, I think now, and did a wonderful series of photographs, and then did an exhibition back in Houston. So I'd love to get a thought or two from her, and others too who I know have been on this tour. Jerry, I'm picking on you. I hope you don't mind. Are you there? She may or may not be. Her microphone may be switched off. If not, I'll get Lois to say something. Lois, are you there?
Nicholas, I am here. Look, it's fascinating. It's wonderful. It's all those amazing layers. What I did like was particularly how you get away from the European construct of this is the European history and that there's other histories in there. I don't really have any questions. It's one of those ones that the more you look at it, the more complicated it becomes.
Absolutely. It was that was a difficulty of mine, was trying to restrict the book because the book could have gone on. I think Simon Sebag Montefiore maybe had this issue as well. Once you start, the book gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing. I've known Matthew for a very long time. I've known Matthew for about I can't remember, 2008, 2009, around there.
It's like 15 years or something.
Yeah, and you were in discussion at that point. The question was that you had several ideas for a book. So how did you come to distill it down to this? Because I mean, there's another idea that I still want you to write about, which is really about the sort of Jewish diaspora in the Maghreb, in North Africa, and how they have been affected by the creation of Israel, and how those communities have been affected. And it's an amazing story. I still hope you're going to write that book. But when did it come down to this? When did you finally get the idea?
It's been a long old tale. I mean, there were discussions with you. I remember you were sitting on my sofa at home. I remember it very well. I don't know which year it was, but I remember you sitting there. We're talking about it. And there were discussions as well with friends in Jerusalem, going back, 2013. It's a very good friend of mine, Raed Saadeh. You may have stayed at his hotel, the Jerusalem Hotel, small boutique hotel.
Yeah.
It's a lovely guy and it's a lovely place. And I remember talking to him in, like I said, 2013-ish. And he had an idea broadly similar to try and tell the story of Jerusalem through the people, through the communities. His idea was a guidebook. He called it a story guide. So instead of a guidebook to all the places, it would be a guidebook to all the people. And we talked a lot. I remember I went back. I was on assignment doing a story from the West Bank in 2017. And I met Riot again. And we talked about it again. And it began to fall into place. It was just over time, the idea, you'll have discovered this as well, the idea has time to marinate. You can it sloshes around, and bits get added on and bits get taken away. Riot was key to it. Riot was an inspiration as an insider in opening doors, but also in having an inside perspective, as Lois said, trying to move on from the perspective. As I said at the beginning, you called it an apology. I'm trying not to apologize, but the perspective, that the baggage that I had carrying with me of the European or American outlooks on the city, and trying instead to listen to what Riot was telling me and to listen to what the people in the city were telling me, and to see that there's another way of being able to understand Jerusalem. It takes a long time. It took a long time. So, it's from then I started in earnest about 2018. And the book finally came out early this year. So that's a fair old time.
The one thing that we haven't spoken about, and this is, some of the key shifts in geography, you mentioned this in the book, is what some people might not realize is that the walls, which were built, was it by Suleiman the Magnificent, so that's 16th century.
1537 to 1541, roughly, when the walls went up.
The fact that the walls are clear and there's no city, you've got a sort of band of about several hundred, about 50 to 100 meters in different places. That's new, and that's British, isn't it? That was something that they deliberately did to create an idea of a separate old city.
Exactly. Well, this bears into some of the stuff that we've been talking about, where these British colonial overseers came to Jerusalem in 1917 and the years thereafter, with an idea of what the place should be like, what they wanted it to look like. The walls appealed very much indeed, because they're grand walls with battlements on the top. That image clicked with them. But whereas previously in the Ottomans, the late Ottoman period, the old city, although Jerusalem had already started to expand outside the walls, the old city was intimately linked with the communities outside. So there was a traffic of movement of people and ideas and commerce and cultures moving through the gates, not as if the gates weren't there, but as if these were neighborhoods on either side of the wall, part of one whole.
Yeah.
That didn't work for the British at all, because this was a holy place. It's a holy city. It's got the church in, and it should be defined by its walls. And so what they did a number of things. But what they did, you were talking about the lawns. They created lawns around the edge of the walls. There were shops and buildings and cafes and restaurants that had been built over the years up against the outside, the external line of the walls. They were ordered to be cleared away, and in their place, these lawns, this sort of green, like it's Leeds Castle or a castle in England, these green lawns created all the way around. What you have is, that's when the idea of an old city first comes into play. You have a sort of sliced and diced, sort of like a museum quarter, and you separate. What they wanted to do is separate the old city, which is this cradle of humanity, away from the ordinary, mundane, workaday new city outside. Yeah. So whereas previously this had been one unified city, then they split it.
That's been amplified, I think, again at the Damascus Gate. What's the Arabic name?
Bab al-Amud.
Bab al-Amud, this is the column, and you talk about that as too, which is buried way beneath the ground as you come through the Damascus Gate. There's a Roman column somewhere underneath there. But it's one of my favourite places because it's enters such a bustling part of a city, a live souk, somewhere where you have a sort of thriving, well, not so much thriving, but it's very busy, sort of trading market area. But then immediately on the outside of it, the Israelis have built this stepped, layered, it's almost like an amphitheater with two Israeli border posts on the outside of it. And it means you no longer have the flow of trade coming from the outside of the city coming into the city. It's completely cut off. And that's now a very sort of tense area as well, where you have these Israeli border guards looking down and monitoring people, controlling people. And if there are young men, frequently they're pulled aside. You've got TV cameras. It's a very, very unpleasant. You really do have a sense of occupation, of an occupying force, basically with the gun keeping control of the local population.
Yeah.
So it leaves a sort of bitter taste in my mouth each time we go there.
Every single time. It's a very poignant place, Damascus Gate, but for the surveillance, the hostile surveillance, that's a sort of ever-present reality there.
Yeah, that's grim. There are hours up, Matthew. Thank you very, very much indeed for your time.
Thank you for having me on, Nick. I've had a lot of fun. It's been great.
Well, it's been really good talking to you too, and we could talk so much more about it. Here's the book again. We just showed up. It's very, very good. It's well worth getting your hands on a copy, and I hope it's going to be released in Australia. Do you have a publication date for Australia? I know you do. It's just been released in the States.
It's out, I think it's out next week in America, under this cover. For some reason, we have a different cover, but still.
Yeah.
I think it's out in Australia already. There is a launch event happening online with the Australian National University in Canberra, happening on the 6th of October. But there are details on my website. My website, matthewtaylor.com, has an events page. And that Australian launch event is listed there, and you can click through and register for that as well.
And if you want to come and see some of those communities, join us on the 22nd of October with our next Israel and Palestine tour. It's the tour we do most consistently. And needless to say, we turn over many of the stones that we've been talking about. But if you really want to, I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's a really, really good introduction to it if you want to really get to know Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. It's been really good hour.
Thank you, Nicholas. I really enjoyed it a lot. Thank you.